Bob worked as a gas fitter for more than 40 years, installing boilers in and around Manchester. Today, the rising cost of fuel and supermarket shops has led him here to a club that sells discounted surplus food.
Yeah, thank you. I've not been putting my heating on yet. I think I will be by the end of this week because it's gone a lot colder. But yeah, food, sometimes you'll grab something that you fancy and then you might say, oh, I can't really afford that, and you'll put that back.
It's no surprise that things have been getting more expensive, but we now know inflation is at a 41-year high. It jumped by 2% in October alone. Now, that's the figure the Bank of England tries to keep it below across an entire year.
Overall inflation rose to 11.1% in the year to October. But if you look at only the price of food, that went up by 16.4%, the highest it's been since 1977. But not everyone experiences inflation equally. Those on the highest incomes face inflation of 9.6%, while those with the lowest income face a 12.5% inflation rate because they spend a bigger share of their income on energy bills and food.
So you get 3 bags of food for £7.50, one of fruit and veg, one of chilled goods, one of cupboard goods. And people tell us typically they save between 25 and 35 quid.
Every penny counts and weighs ever lighter for those dropping in. Demand is now so high that for the first time, the food club can't help everyone who asks.
So how many people did you have to turn away then today?
We probably had to turn away 30% of the people that we would like to serve today, just because we're completely oversubscribed.
As well as a food club, this is a warm bank offering locals respite from mounting energy bills. The government's energy price guarantee will hold the average family's yearly bills down to £2,500 until April. And all eyes will be on the Chancellor's autumn statement tomorrow.
We welcome that benefits will increase in line with inflation, but genuinely, it's not even going to touch the sides. Much more needs to be done. Our members are not just on benefits, they're also the low-paid workers. They're also families on zero-hour contracts or on gig economies. So everything needs to be looked at, and unfortunately, it's a really complex issue because it's not just benefits that need to be addressed, it's salaries and it's combating inflation.
It's those who can least afford it that inflation's hitting the hardest, those to whom tomorrow's measures will matter the most, those holding their breath for the difficult decisions the Chancellor says are on the way.
Well, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, blamed high inflation on the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of the pandemic. He said his autumn statement tomorrow would help to drive down inflation by what he called tough but necessary decisions on tax and spending. Our economics reporter, Neil McDonald, is with me. So these grim figures on inflation, is this as bad as it gets?
Well, a lot of economists think that's right. This is as bad as it gets. And it is just worth reminding ourselves just how bad it is. As Amelia was explaining, inflation in October in 1 month was 2%, when the annual rate of inflation target is for 2%. So where do we go from here? Well, I'll show you the Bank of England's forecast for inflation over the next 3 years, peaking now, staying around 10% over the winter, but then falling away. And the reason for that fall is partly to do with the fact that, of course, inflation is about the rate of change in prices. So we know that for food and gas and electricity, prices have gone up very sharply. If those prices now stop going up, or even if they just go up but at a slower pace, then that will be enough to bring inflation under control, bring it down. Of course, it will mean households will still be facing historically incredibly high bills. Yeah,
prices will stay high. Now, I mean, when it comes to the autumn statement tomorrow, the pitch has been well and truly rolled. We've been warned and warned that there's this huge black hole in the public finances. I mean, is there? What is it?
Well, the black hole debate is all about the rules that the government chooses to impose on itself about how much it thinks it should be borrowing. And what it is saying at the moment is that it wants all government debts to be falling as a share of our national income. And it was saying that it wanted that to happen in 3 years' time. It's probably likely tomorrow to push that promise out to about 5 years' time. However, a couple of weeks ago, the Institute for Fiscal Studies came up with this forecast. And what that line shows is government debts as a share of our national income going up and up and up for the next 5 years, not falling at all. If that forecast were correct, then the government is going to miss its own rule, and the IFS says if you want that line to be falling in 5 years' time, you need to find £60 billion of savings, whether that's through tax rises, spending cuts, or both.
So how worried do we need to be about that? I mean, could it change?
Yeah, I mean, the point about this is it's a forecast based on estimates about what's going to happen to economic growth and interest rates and inflation. And of course, they could all change for the better. And if they do, the black hole disappears. It's worth remembering that they have all changed actually for the worse over the last 6 months, so that's possible as well. We could also just scrap the fiscal rule and say we're not going to try and bring our total borrowing down as a share of national income. However, we are still going to have to borrow a huge amount of money from the financial markets. And I think the question is, if we water down or scrap the fiscal rules, is there a danger that that could trigger both the loss of confidence and the very sharp rise in interest rates, which of course ultimately swept away the Truss government?
Neil McDonald, thank you. Well, with those tax hikes and spending cuts due to be announced by the Chancellor tomorrow, there are signs of growing unease among some Conservative MPs tonight. Our policy correspondent, Paul McNamara, joins us from Westminster. Paul, who's worried and how worried?
Very worried, in short. There is a lot of anxiety right now, and by perhaps not tomorrow night, but certainly by Friday and next week, when the numbers have been unpicked, the full fallout of the budget becomes apparent. Conservative MPs are preparing themselves for a very rocky time. Tonight, though, it's not the scale of cuts that they're worried about, it's tax rises. Conservative MPs I've spoken to have been told to prepare themselves for the highest tax burden in 80 to 90 years. And there is real anger about this. One backbencher put it to me, people are going to say to me on the doorstep, what's the difference between you and the Labour Party? And they'll be right, I'm not going to have a leg to stand on. And just to underline that, in the last couple of minutes, this letter has been sent from Jonathan Gullis, a backbench MP, to the Chancellor with a series of demands focusing on either scaling back duty on fuel, or if not, freezing it for the duration of Parliament. He's also demanding a meeting. But look, it's not just a letter from one MP. It's signed by 22 other MPs, which our viewers will be familiar with. Priti Patel, Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, Brendan Lewis. One name that isn't on this list, though, is Esther McVey. And she stood up in Parliament today and she said, I will not vote for tax rises unless HS2 is scrapped. She's very important because she's seen as influential on the right. Rishi Sunak isn't just going to have a tough time selling this budget to voters, he's going to have a heck of a time selling it to his own MPs.
Thanks, Paul. So, are austerity and tax rises the only options or a political choice that could be avoided? Joining me now, Carl Emerson, who's Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and with me in the studio, Caris Roberts, Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR. Caris, there's been this sort of consensus, hasn't there, of sort of the grown-ups saying, we've got to get serious, there's a black hole, we've got to fill that hole, and that means tax cuts and spending, tax rises and spending cuts. You have been saying not necessarily. Can you explain why?
Well, actually, I don't think there has been a consensus among economists about the scale of tax cuts or even fiscal changes needed. So as we just heard, the government has been talking about the gap between its current plans and those plans that it would need to have to meet its own fiscal rules. Now, fiscal rules can be changed, and also there's a lot of uncertainty about how you could get there. So there are huge assumptions being made necessarily in any forecast about, for example, the cost of government borrowing, and that could all change. But the other critical point that I would raise is that, as well as spending cuts, tax rises are an option. So when we're told that spending cuts are inevitable, that's simply not the case.
So you think we should go ahead with tax rises, but not spending cuts?
I think there is a case for some tax rises, yes. And I do think it's important that the government has a credible plan for its public finances and the economy. And I don't think spending cuts is the way to get there.
Carl Emerson, I mean, the IFS is sort of the oracle at times like this. Can you be clear? Is this choice, this combination, you know, an option or the only choice, the only thing we could do?
I think what's not an option is the Chancellor needs to think really very, very carefully about the trade-off between does he need to do action now in order to demonstrate credibility to the markets? If he doesn't do enough of that, it could be very costly. We saw what happened after the mini-budget. But if he does too much, there are clearly risks to the economy over the next few months. Versus the option of saying, well, do I pencil in perhaps tax rises or spending cuts for a few years' time when we're through this winter, when hopefully we're through an energy crisis, and then hope that growth turns out better than we expect, hope that perhaps the gap that may need to be filled turns out to be smaller, and then some of those tax rises or spending cuts won't be needed. So a more nimble, flexible approach. And that's the really difficult trade-off I think he's got to make. What he definitely has a choice over is if he does want to try and implement measures to reduce borrowing, he has a clear choice between do you want to do that on the tax side or the spending side. So he could go for more taxes or less spending, or he could go for more on the terms of spending cuts and less in terms of tax rises. That is definitely a choice.
Right, so you could have a budget tomorrow which didn't have any spending cuts.
You certainly could. The tax burden is already at very high levels by UK standards, though, and you can see why perhaps a Conservative Chancellor doesn't want to push it up further. But it's also worth pointing out in Western Europe and in Scandinavia, there are successful economies that have a bigger tax burden than us. So that's a political choice that can be made.
Right. Karis, I mean, a lot of people were saying, but hang on, when the government went for more borrowing over the summer, the Kwarteng budget, the markets went mad, we're all paying the price for it now, we shouldn't be taking any risks.
They're right that a lot went wrong over the summer and indeed in that mini-budget. But we're not in a public finance crisis now, I would argue. I think that was other reasons that made that such a problem. And I think one thing that is missing from this debate sometimes is that it really matters what you're spending the money on. So if you're trying to get debt to fall as a proportion of national income, the national income piece really matters. So we need to be doing the things that are going to support the economy in the long run. Now, my view...
So invest more?
Yes, exactly. In my view, I don't think tax cuts for the very richest achieve that, and I don't think markets believe that they would either. But if we had well-targeted investment that could grow the economy and ensure that people's incomes don't get ripped out so that people have cash in their pockets which they can put back into the economy, then that is the basis for a credible growth plan, I would say.
Carl, do you think spending more tomorrow is a credible option?
Well, hoping for more growth is certainly something we should all hope for. The Truss government wasn't wrong to say that growth was a good thing. And there's lots of things we could do if we wanted to try and bring about more growth. But it is certainly easier said than done. And I think it's also important to remember that, yes, when we get those forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility tomorrow, it will be the case that those forecasts will end up being wrong. It could be that they're wrong in the sense that things turn out much better than we expect, but given they're trying to produce a central forecast, it's also possible things, unfortunately, will turn out worse than we expect.
I mean, the bottom line is that people tomorrow are going to feel terrible when they're hit by more tax rises, and they're going to wonder how they can pay their bills. And what we want to really understand is, was there another way? You know, and Carl, I mean, are you saying, you know, there is, but it's risky?
I'm saying that if we want to get serious about a growth strategy, the government needs to look at a whole range of areas like immigration policy, planning policy, lots of different areas where it's very tricky, and any growth rewards probably come over the very longer term. Really what's going on at the moment, which households, businesses, public services and the Chancellor is grappling with, is the fact that because Russia's invaded Ukraine, because energy prices are very high and because the UK imports energy, we're poorer as a country, which means some painful adjustments need to be made.
Thank you. Just in a few seconds, Karis.
To get the economy on track, we need to be fueling the things that will make it run. So that's people's incomes, it's businesses, it's public services, and it's simply not a choice to leave them behind tomorrow.
Karis Roberts and Carl Emerson, thank you both very much.